is our last of our Elevating Women in Leadership taster sessions. So thank you for joining us. We're going to explore this final topic of adding strategic value. So let me just move this on. Lovely. So my name is Orla Power. And I design and deliver our Elevating Women in Leadership programs. I'm also joined by Pauline Muldoon from the Women in Leadership team. And we've also got Sinead Laverty, who is a Women in Leadership speaker for us and a number of other clients as well. So you'll be hearing from all of us during this session. So this month we celebrated International Women's Day with the theme of embracing equity. And we all know that equity is about providing additional support where it's needed to create that level playing field for everyone. So by focusing on specific areas that are particularly relevant to women, we can help to close that gap so we can all see over the fence. And based on our research into the behaviours and beliefs of women who excel, our programmes and these sessions are designed to focus on those leadership areas most relevant to women. So if you've joined any of the other sessions, welcome back. If this is your first time, let me just quickly outline what we're going to be doing in this session. So we've been taking you through how we deliver our Elevating Women in Leadership programs, and we're going to give you as much insight and development as we can in the next 50 minutes or so. So for those of you thinking about your own development today, we have created a worksheet. Hopefully you've received that in advance, but Graham's going to post that in the chat if you haven't. So you've got that as a takeaway to reflect on. We've also recommended throughout these that you find a buddy to talk to so that you can talk to them what comes up during the session. We do this on our programme so that everyone has a buddy throughout to support them and really support them in terms of the actions that they're taking. So I hope if you've joined some of these sessions before, you've found someone that you can chat these things through with. And lastly, webinar format. We've got a lot of people joining today, so this isn't our normal virtual learning platform. So there's a bit of limited interactivity, but we will be getting you to do polls and use the chat. So get ready and we'll be asking you to get involved. If you've got any questions and answers, pop them using the Q&A button, and we'll have a bit of time at the end to answer those. We're not sending out the slides, but you will get a recording of the session. So you'll be able to pause and replay your favourite bits to your heart's content. So we're coming to the end of the programme, and before this session, you would have attended a discovery session. So as we've mentioned throughout, these are an opportunity to share successes and actions taken since the last workshop. And I know it's only a week, but please feel free, if you were here last week, to share any successes or actions in the chat as a result of the session on impact and brand. So that was run by Colette and Felicia. So anything that you're doing to be more authentic, whether you've had a go at sharing your personal brand, or if you've worked on sharing your achievements confidently, or increased your impact by perhaps maybe not over apologizing or not brushing off that positive feedback. So if there's anything that you've been able to do over the last week, we'd love to hear those or see those in the chat. Because by the time we get to these final discovery sessions in any of our programs, we'd really be encouraging the group to be facilitating these sessions themselves so that they can continue to run these smaller group coaching sessions once the actual formal program finishes. So it's really about sustaining their learning. And if this was a program for first line or middle managers, we would usually finish it after 3 modules. But if it is for that sort of upper middle and senior leaders, we have this additional adding strategic value session. So I'll just check the chat. So thanks, Jodie, for sharing. So thank you for waiting for me when you joined a meeting. Lovely, that's great. And you didn't apologise. Wow, great. Okay, so again, about apologetic language. So actually just noticing that Yeah, felt powerful. Amazing. Great. So lovely to hear some of those tips that you got last week and putting those into practice and using them. And notice, as you say, notice how it makes you feel and what the impact is. Stopped using just, and does that make sense? Lovely. Again, creating more power in the language that we're communicating. Fabulous. Love all those ideas. So yeah, pop those in the chat. Working on becoming less nice, more direct and less apologetic. So that sounds like quite a theme from last one, a big one for me. Yeah, great, thank you. Thanks for sharing all of those. Okay, so this week we're going to be focusing on adding strategic value. So this is this last workshop. So let's get going so we can give you some more hints and tips around this topic. So we start off by focusing on some of the possible headwinds to adding strategic value, then look at your current focus and how you're currently adding value, including saying no. And then we look at increasing the visibility of our strategic thinking by how we communicate. So one of the things we know is that research has shown that women can be perceived as less strategic, not necessarily because the capability is lacking, but because sometimes things just get in the way, such as what we pay attention to, where we focus our time, how we communicate, and how we build strategic relationships. So just think for a second, whether it's always you that picks up the action points in meetings, whilst others, sit back. We think we're being helpful, but consciously or unconsciously, we're taking that role of doer or order taker, executor. And it can perpetuate being trapped in the weeds while leaving others to move on to those more strategic activities. And over time, this can lead to those false perceptions that women are best at executing, good at the details, and essential to keep the ship running, rather than having that strategic capability to think long term, to contribute those big ideas or influence the stakeholders needed for success. And of course, we all know that simply isn't the case. Another headwind that women face around this issue is how we're raised and socialized. We often grow up believing that a good team player pitches in and helps. We say yes and not no. And sometimes it can be hard not to swoop in and take on the admin work when perhaps no one else is speaking up, or when things aren't done to our standards. So today, we'd like you to think about, do you add your full strategic value? Is the daily whirlwind sucking you into a tactical frenzy with little time to look into the horizon? So this session is time to reevaluate your true value and focus your activities. So we start the workshop with, of course, welcome back. And the first thing I'd like us all to be thinking about is, what does being strategic mean to you in your organization? Because we find that being strategic can mean different things in different organizations and have a different interpretation. So I'd love you to pop your answers in the chat. So what does being strategic mean in your organization or to you? And while you're doing that, I'll just give you some examples of some of the areas that it could be. And as I say, it varies from organization to organization. So having that business acumen, so knowing your business inside and out and the wider context in which it operates, and the factors that affect its success, not just your areas, but across the business. In order to be strategic, you need that really solid understanding of your industry context, the trends, the business drivers. And future focused, so knowing where your business is heading, how it wants to grow, and how you are contributing to that. So it's about paying attention to organizational messages and continually aligning your workload, objectives, and messages to your team, translating them into what's meaningful for them. So it's about that focus on new possibilities and long term, thinking further out, switching on your radar and looking beyond the horizon, not just what comes next. I'm seeing a lot of those coming up in the chat about that future focused and about innovating, seeing the bigger picture. And then also having a point of view on important topics in your area. So, you know, for example, 3 points on the impact of any current change you're experiencing, 3 trends in your work area. This is about communicating strategically. So you've done the thinking, it's about having those points ready to share. And that strategic thinking should reflect multiple viewpoints, not just your own. So it shows that you've read and interpreted information, considered the wider business beyond your work area, and you're demonstrating a point of view. And I'll come back to that a bit later in this session. So yeah, in the chat, I can see lots of aspects around that bigger picture, aligning what we do. Okay, and you know, sharing our views. So I've just seen someone there about sharing their views and opinions. I'll come back to that because there is a difference between sharing an opinion, a view, and having a point of view. So we'll look at that in terms of how we can communicate strategically. Okay, so the first part, as I say, is getting really clear for you and in your organisation, what does being strategic mean? And it could be one or a combination of some of these things. So what can get in the way of being strategic? So I'm going to hand over to Pauline to take us through some of those things that can get in the way for us.
Thank you, Orla. And I noticed in the comments, someone said about aligning their objectives to the bigger picture, which I think is a really important one. So what gets in our way? What are the headwinds to being strategic? We're going to run a poll in a minute to see which ones resonate with you. So the 4 ones that we see with women working in organizations are, number 1, drowning in execution. So if you're someone who really wants to get the job done, and sometimes we can feel if we want to get the job done, give it to me, I'll get it done, I'm super efficient. And that can turn into a bit of a vicious cycle. So we get more and more. So we encourage everyone to regularly have what we call a job laundry. Consider what the purpose of your role is and how you're working to that purpose. Another barrier is multitasking overstrength. Now, so much in the media about women and multitasking, and studies do show that women are better at multitasking, and also we do it more often, which isn't always so good. The problem with over multitasking is it can lead to less productivity. It can lower the quality of what we're doing, and also will impact our well-being. It will make us feel frenzied, and our well-being will not be quite so positive. It can leave us being distracted and overwhelmed. And what that does is it reinforces our being tactical. We're on the hamster wheel, we're trying to get stuff done, and we're not stopping to look up and think about the bigger picture. Another headwind is keeping tight control. So are you someone who likes to take control? You care about how and when and what is being done? Or another challenge is you've high empathy. Everyone's busy in an organization. So we feel bad about asking someone else to pick up the work. We feel guilty, and so we take it on ourselves. And then the final one is avoiding risk. And whether that's going out on a limb with an untested idea, or speaking up in meetings, or taking on a role we're not prepared for. So research shows that men will go for a role if they feel that they can do 50 to 60% of it. Women, we tend to want to ensure that we can fully do it and do it really well. So we will only put ourselves out there, take the risk, and go for something if we feel really comfortable. So we're going to run a poll now to see which barriers resonate with you. So while that poll is running, I mean, you know, some that I struggle with and have battled with in the past and still do is execution. So I really want to get stuff done. And, you know, we give many solutions in the worksheets, but for me, one is accepting that your to-do list is a constant companion. It's not an enemy. You're never, ever going to get to the bottom of that to-do list. Also, I saw, I think it was an article, but, you know, something that really struck me once is the reality that in every day at work, something is going to be let down. And don't let that thing or person be you. Another one for me is about keeping control. And really, let's reframe that need to keep control. Because if we reframe asking for help, it's an opportunity to develop someone else, to help someone else step up a little. So, you know, avoid that, keeping control. And then finally, to avoid risk, we need to let go of fear. A TED talk I always recommend is Amy Cuddy. She talks about the power of body language. And actually, for me, my biggest takeaway from that is not about the power of body language, but it's about that we are getting in our own way. So fake it till you believe it. So take the chance, step out there. So I think we've ended the poll there. So many people. So highest are drowning in execution, stuck in the daily grind. So that's 62%. That's quite a lot. So we all need to feel a bit more comfortable with our to-do list. The next one is multitasking. So 55% struggle with that, feeling distracted, you know, trying to do too many things. And I think with women, sometimes that, you know, can tip into our personal lives as well. And then we're frazzled both at home and at work. Third one is 43% struggle with keeping tight control, feeling that it's better and faster if we do it. And then 28% about avoiding risk. And what's lovely to hear is 2% are saying none of the above. So that is wonderful. Orla, before I hand over to you, you're going to talk about adding strategic value. Any of them resonate with you?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think as some people have put in the chat, this slide is so me. I think I saw someone saying, so yes, all of these. So yeah, and similar to your tips, you know, getting comfortable with the to-do list. So, you know, I refresh it, but it's never going to go away, and I'm comfortable with that. I've recently used my out of office more, so blocked time out and put my out of office on so that I can protect time, and that's worked. Or trying a change of scene. So, you know, I work from home a lot. So if I want to do a sort of thinky piece, I mean, it might seem odd, but actually changing the scene, going to a cafe and doing that away from the desk has actually worked for me. So yeah, trying a different place. Or if you work from home a lot, maybe try going into the office and finding that space to do it. And then the other one is, I think, around the avoiding risk, and we'll talk a bit more about it later in the communicating, but planning to speak. So if I know I've got meetings coming up, I actually just have, you know, instead of, as you say, being on that hamster wheel, is just taking 5 minutes before a meeting to think, okay, what would I like to say and how can I get that across? And making a few notes so that I'm ready when that opportunity presents itself within that meeting or session. So yeah, just grabbing those little slivers of time to be really thoughtful in what I'm doing.
Absolutely. And in the program, obviously, it's really useful for people to discuss and share tips and strategies. For me, I've never thought about the out of office one, so I've taken that from today. Thank you. So I know that people find it really powerful in the program to hear what works for other people, and then we can try it ourselves.
Yeah, perfect. And if anyone's got tips themselves, start posting them in the chat, because again, that can be really useful when you hear what works for someone else. And that's the beauty of these sorts of programs, bringing women together about what they've found works for them and trying new things. Perfect. Thanks, Pauline. And as Pauline said, this is on your worksheet to reflect on. What strategies could you action to overcome some of these headwinds? So I've seen people are starting to jot some of those down. Yeah, I love that one about booking meetings as 45 minutes rather than an hour. And that gets you that thinking time and certainly time to prepare for the next one. So keep those coming and see what you can pick up from those that might be useful for you. So back on the programme, this would be time. We'd probably have a break after this session because this gets quite involved. Lots of people get lots of things from this session. So we stop and have a good 20-minute break after this activity that Pauline talked about around what are some of the barriers that challenge you and what are some of the strategies for overcoming those. So when we come back, we start looking at this area of adding strategic value. So depending on the job you do or the level in your organisation, not everything can be focused on strategic. So it's useful to consider what areas of your role are currently adding that strategic value or could be adding more strategic value. So in what ways are you adding that value? What does it mean for you in your role? And it could be some of these. So these are just a few examples to get you thinking. And in the pre-work for the programme, people will have thought about these and assessed where they're at. But just to give you a flavour, is it being a translator of your organisation's strategy so that people understand where the company's going and how they fit in? Prioritising the focus of yourself or your team based on that strategy and changing the focus when necessary. Planning your team's work with that longer focus in mind. Delegating to ensure that work gets done so that you can focus on those higher value activities. Developing your team and really having that growing successors and future leaders hat on as you're thinking about their development, that succession planning. With continuous improvement, ensuring the quality that's expected by your customers and thinking ahead and trying to anticipate how that needs to improve and change. And talking of change, refocusing the work based on changes led by the environment and the senior leaders in your organisation. Are you endorsing your team's work and promoting and profiling what they do and sharing that importance upwards? And then are you proactively sharing valuable insights upwards because, you're closer to the pulse of the organisation, to those customers, those clients, what's going on, proactively sharing that upwards. So we're just going to look at that last one. And again, a little activity to get you thinking about this and just invite you, if you're comfortable, to share your self-rating in the chat. Would you say you're more on the tactical side, that you're, so busy that you contribute ideas when you're asked, but it's not something that you think of sort of proactively? It's only when it becomes critical and you're having to innovate under pressure. Or are you at that other end where it is something that you focus on, you're sharing those insights proactively and doing that on an ongoing basis and regularly taking that time for innovative thinking, or somewhere in the middle, somewhere around a 3. So just pop what you would put yourself, just so that we can get a feel. So see if you 2s, 4, great, 3 to 4, 3s, 2, so somewhere around the 4s. So we've got a few 4s coming in, lovely. Oh, a 5 flashed by there, so that's great, something that you're really focused on. Yeah, 2, 3, another 5. So yeah, a really big range of where people are seeing themselves. So imagine yourself doing that for each of those areas and each of the aspects in your job and role, and seeing if you can sort of tease out what are the aspects of work that you're currently doing that are more on that strategic side. And as Pauline was saying, the challenge is that we often get stuck in the inbox, don't we? And we don't take time to truly add our strategic value. We focus too much on the tactical execution, too much time working in the business and not enough time working on the business. So as I mentioned, as part of the pre-work, we give people that opportunity to self-assess themselves and chance to actually review what that's telling you about where you're focusing your attention and your activities. And I've mentioned that it's important to keep this big picture perspective, to free yourself from drowning in that execution and get that balance. And it's really difficult to think big picture if you're constantly task switching or if your day is packed with meetings. And if this is you're not alone. Up to 96% of leaders say that time is the biggest roadblock to having that time to do that strategic thinking. So we ask people to really assess their current focus. So is it around that high value work, those strategic activities that you need to keep doing? What about the low value work? And by this, I mean work that adds little value or could potentially be done somewhere else, so that you can make room for that new value work, those strategic activities you've got little time for yet. And that low value work, it's also referred to sometimes as non-promotable tasks, NPT. I don't know if you've heard that. There was a great Harvard Business Review where they did a study and found that women volunteer for these non-promotable tasks more than men. And we're more frequently asked to take these tasks on. And when we are asked, we're more likely to say yes. So these low value, non-promotable tasks are those that benefit the organisation, but likely don't contribute to your performance evaluation or career advancement. They're sort of like the office admin or the office housework. Things like maybe covering for a colleague, serving on a low-ranking committee, or taking on routine work that doesn't require much skill or produce much impact. And, you know, that doing a lot of that can have serious consequences if we're disproportionately saddled with work that has that little visibility or impact. And again, the study showed that we're likely to take on more of that. And that's not a gender preference. It's more a shared understanding that women will volunteer more than men. So what's the solution? Well, it's not to, I mean, I've seen in the chat, people want to say no, and we're coming on to that. Pauline's going to cover that. But, you know, these things do have to be done, and we do have to take our fair share. And that's the point. It's our fair share. So maybe if we could instead ask for ways to distribute these tasks more equitably. So, you know, if you always take the minutes or write up the actions, suggest that everyone takes a turn, because while you're doing that, you're not able to then contribute effectively in that session if you're the one taking the notes and having to do that. So start to think about whether you have some of that low value work woven in that you can think about in different ways. And if you determine that you've got some of that work, you're not adding the right value, here are some strategies that you can start to think about and use. So do you have a standing meeting that isn't achieving anything, or a report that isn't required? So time to delete and remove that. Delay, so are there things you could delay to stay focused on other more important work? Could you renegotiate timelines? Could you distribute the work to someone who's better suited to it? Is there work you could outsource more effectively rather than doing it yourself? And if you don't have someone to delegate to, because some of us don't, think about breaking up some of your work into mini projects that might benefit others' development, so peers or colleagues. I've done this recently, and some of my team have taken on areas because they're going to benefit by developing a skill, and it's an area of interest for them. So that sort of co-option and promoting that as a development area can really be useful. But I think the most valuable of all of the strategies is this diminish. So our work can snowball over time and become bigger and more cumbersome than it needs to be. So Pauline mentioned about this job laundry. You know, do you have a meeting that's grown to 2 hours when half an hour would do with a concentrated effort? Is there a report that could be pared back to be more focused? How could we get to the heart of what's required and reduce all those less valuable activities that might have grown up around it? So this is about regularly reviewing your activities. Have that job laundry and a clear out. Audit your schedule, look for meetings that you can eliminate or outsource, take back control of your calendar, blocking off time and creating those better boundaries. It's about that ruthless prioritization. And staying focused on what's the most important thing I need to accomplish in this role. And I've put this on your worksheet as something for you to think about and be focused on it. So it's come up quite a bit about saying no. So Pauline, I'm going to hand over to thinking about making those strategic choices and managing our boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely. And the challenge, obviously, is even when we know what we should be focusing on, it's difficult to maintain that focus because new activities, new requests are always coming in. And it's challenging to say no to all of these activities. Partly it can be for some people because we don't want to seem harsh. We don't want to seem to be not a team player. We don't want to seem to be not supportive. And then on the flip side, sometimes when you take something on, you get it done, that can feel really good. But actually, were you contributing to your success or to someone else's success? Because the reality is, whenever you say yes to something, you are by default saying no to something else. So we have a discussion in the program, which is a really powerful discussion about when saying yes is strategic and when saying no is strategic. So, you know, what situation would make saying yes strategic, even when you've no time. So for example, is it very important to our customers? Is it important for our strategy? Will it provide me with exposure? Will it raise my profile or stretch my skills? And what situations make saying no strategic? Obviously, when it deletes focus, or when we're unable to deliver on a promise, or when it's clearly outside of our scope. So if you go to the next slide, Orla, we, as part of the program, we get participants to revisit a time when they did or didn't say no. And we talk about what insights they had and also what they need to think about going forward. So we know saying no can be challenging, and how you say no is really important. And I think it was Anne-Sophie in the chat said, how do we say no? So on the next slide, how you say no is really important. So here's some tips for you. Obviously, acknowledge the person making the request, saying no politely and clearly. And I think for me, the clearly part is really important, because if we're fumbling and half saying no when we're really torn, that's going to give someone an opening and we might end up taking on the task. If it's strategically appropriate, be sure to give a rationale. And if, again, it's appropriate, offer an alternative. So you can, offer it to someone in your team, or you can pinpoint someone else who might be better placed. An example on a recent program was a woman, she was the only woman on a senior leadership team, and she had somehow fallen into the situation where she was taking notes at every meeting. And she realized that she was pigeonholed into doing the role, and she felt trapped, as if it was expected. So everyone would sit down and look to her to take the notes. So at the next meeting, she clearly thought about this. At the next meeting, after being on the program, she suggested and was very clear that she would prefer if note-taking rotated. And that way it would enable her to really focus and to contribute more. And she also offered to take turns in chairing the meeting. So that's a very small change and really powerful, both for her contribution and how she is viewed in that meeting. So on the program, this takes us up to lunch. And the activity before lunch is to walk and talk with your buddy about the areas you need to strengthen. So it's a key thing to get away from screens. And the activity is on your worksheet for you to do. So we have an hour for lunch with networking for those who would like to do it. And on each program, we aim to have speakers, because women like to learn through hearing others' stories. And it's nice to see role models and to see people that we identify with and how they've, moved forward. So I know that Colette and Felicia talked about the benefit of speakers on the last session. And we have Sinead here, who's a regular speaker on our programs. So Sinead, what do you think is important for speakers to share that benefits the participants?
Thank you, Pauline. Obviously, I'm a huge advocate for this part of the programme, actually, and have always been very grateful to be given the opportunity to support. But I guess in terms of, if I start with sort of thinking about what makes this sort of work, it comes from, I think, probably a couple of elements for me. Firstly, I genuinely believe women need role models. And we all need role models, but particularly women. And I think that's well documented, isn't it? And there's an increasing sort of social movement building around this. And I love, for those of us in England, I love what the Lionesses have achieved in terms of girls' grassroots football, and that sense of, if you can see it, you can be it. So seeing is believing, and the swell that that's brought, I think that's a really lovely kind of example of what that does. But I also caution, actually, and this is sort of one of my observations partnering with my team here at LHH, is that when we talk about guest speakers and role modeling, it doesn't have to be the most senior sort of shop window in terms of a woman in an organization. In fact, I would almost argue that the most senior woman in an organization is best being a sponsor of women or a women in leadership program. So a different role. And I say that partly because that seeing is believing. is about real resonance and connection. And I think that actually it's sometimes about just finding those short-term adjustments towards that longer-term goal or that longer-term success. So I think that's where that sort of role modeling comes from for me. Secondly, and I know we've touched on the term community, but women, again, well documented, really thrive in, well, and seek out communities actually. We all seek belonging, but particularly women will seek out communities. And I've experienced our Women in Leadership programs. I know how much they sort of encourage and invite this sort of vulnerability and sharing and learning, and that really sort of safe space to be very, very authentic and potentially unmasked within a safe community. And therefore, again, I think a guest speaker is somebody who can actually do that comfortably, feel quite unmasked and being almost at one with that community. So that it's that ability to connect at a level, but equally potentially elevate, I think, with maybe a greater context and understanding. So that ability to have stepped back and really kind of thought about these key headwinds and have maybe a career story that's very, very connectable, but with a little bit more structure and thinking around that. And I say this thing about, if a guest speaker can kind of come in and connect very quickly with an audience, be quite vulnerable themselves, it really does give permission for others to maybe follow that and that sort of ripple effect. And one of the things I love about these sort of safe communities, and when you bring a guest speaker in as well, and you're acknowledging these common headwinds that women face, is that you get the sense of it's not just me, i.e. the headwinds or the barriers or the challenges. It's not fix thyself. And I think that's so much more pertinent in an age of burnout as well, for us all to kind of reflect on the power of that it's not just me. Very, very powerful. And as I said, I think guest speakers can sometimes with their storytelling really kind of elevate and bring that to life again. Pauline, I don't know if you had a few questions in particular, or if you're happy for me to kind of...
I was going to ask you a question, Sinead, just before we move on. Well, if you were a speaker on this session around adding strategic value, what is something that you could share for everyone that's listening? Yeah, what would be a sort of something that works for you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what's interesting, actually, if I was to join a strategic thinking, one of the benefits I have working within the LHH team is that I actually understand that there will have been some learning context that's gone before. And I love the fact that when we articulate around strategic thinking or some of how we approach it, we're often building on some of the other elements around career activism. So being very intentional around the difference between sort of keeping things in your head and articulating, advocating, the resilience and the energy piece that underpins that. And I think then the personal branding, they all become actually very inextricably linked when you get to this piece. So for me, I think it's that bit about maybe drawing through and connecting these within a strategic elevation. So Orla, to answer your question, sometimes it's the simple examples of the realizations that we've had. So one of the stories I would share is that I had that realization that I was letting my results speak for themselves. And it's that bit about, I hadn't fully appreciated how I was perceived until I sort of stepped back and took on board sort of feedback. And I was thinking, but I do think strategically. My brain's always thinking to the next thing we can be, and I've got really pulling market intelligence. But fundamentally, I wasn't articulating. So my personal brand, if you like, so I'm linking back to that, was Sinead's a top performer. Not Sinead's really, got this great strategic vision, or Sinead's got the ability to think in this way, which is actually where I was perceiving myself to be. And it was that beautiful kind of understanding of the capabilities there, but the perception isn't. And that was something that was within my control. I think that was the exciting bit. And then for me, actually, the bit I'm going to couple this with was also this lovely little bit of feedback I'd also had. And we've always got to choose to listen to it, whether or not you choose to action it, listen to it, because it is a perception. was that I was turning up to all these wonderful virtual meetings that we do, probably a few too many back to back, and I would want to quite quickly get into things, but it was important to me to socially connect first. So I would often say, how are you? And to kind of give everybody a really nice platform. And I would say, and I'm great, I'm really busy, super busy, juggling everything. And I would start with this sort of almost humble sort of, I'll invite everybody to feel really good, and then we'll get going. But of course, what I was actually doing was diluting any of my then presentation around strategic visioning and thinking and all this sort of intentional effort that I prepared for. I diluted it with that first impact of, I'm busy. And so it'd be, Sinead's a top performer and she's busy. You know, that's actually what I was kind of creating, and the rest of my work could actually be diluted by this daily interaction. And I share that, Orla, because, you know, I'm a working mom. So when I'm guest speaking, some of what I'm bringing to life is I know exactly what it is to start the working day in that frenzy. And it's challenging in this sort of virtual world as well to sort of delineate. We operate in this much more fused space. And so actually we do need to intentionally acknowledge that, yes, I feel busy as I'm starting my day, and that is inevitable potentially, or are there things I can adjust? For me, I felt I couldn't make a huge amount of adjustments to my busy before the day started. And so I worked intentionally at replacing the word busy. And I did that through sharing things like, oh, I've just read this great article, or I listened to this podcast. And what I was trying to do was carefully start to reframe how I was being perceived and just break a habit, just like you would with your diet or your exercise. But it was one thing I worked on to impact that. And I think I genuinely believe have made some positive strides with, but it requires continual effort, easy to fall back into.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sinead, for sharing that. And that's a beautiful example of how a speaker can share a really practical example that's worked for them, that you can start to see, oh, I could try that. I could really think about how I'm turning up to meetings and how I'm starting those, and the words and the language that we're using. Brilliant. Thanks, Sinead. And that leads me beautifully, nice segue, that wasn't planned, into talking about this final section around communicating strategically. And as Sinead said, hopefully you've got lots of ideas and strategic thoughts going on in your heads, but a challenge can be expressing them to others in ways where we come across as strategic. So this isn't about, you know, sounding smart or using big words. It's about linking to your business goals and the things that are important in your organization and showing that business and commercial acumen. So just pop in the chat for me. We're just going to talk about the differences between men and women on the language used in their approach to conversation. So just pop in the chat if you've noticed any differences between language used and approach to conversations. And then while you do that in terms of communication, I'll just share a few differences that we know about that you might have experienced. So men and women do have different natural speaking styles. So men can be more assertive, they speak up more, they interrupt more often, and women are more expressive and tend to speak up less often, especially when in a minority or in a hierarchy. And we can find it hard to break into the conversation. And as Sinead was sharing, we like to build that relationship at the start of conversation. So men, again, this is generally, but men tend to use conversation to achieve those tangible outcomes and can engage in great debate and then let it go straight after the conversation is over. Whereas women tend to want to enhance social connection and create relationships. And we can overthink what's said and how it was said and maybe take things more personally. And of course, it's okay for there to be differences, and there are, you can see some of those appearing in the chat. You know, it's fine, there's bound to be differences, but it's about keeping an eye on whether this affects your visibility. For example, you know, you don't have to start interrupting and speaking over as well, but you do have to be aware of your contribution and find ways to make sure that that contribution isn't lost. So at this point, we put participants in breakout groups to discuss what they've noticed about communication and share some strategies to overcome any of those sort of challenges. So I've noticed some of these, popping up in the chat. So start to think about what are some of the strategies to get around some of those. So, things that come up are having an ally in a meeting and being an ally for others. So someone who will ensure that your contribution isn't lost, who'll pick up on that and will invite you into the conversation. If it's a virtual meeting, use the Teams chat function to make points if you haven't been able to get it across verbally. And summarizing is a great way of, if you feel like, I haven't got anything to add to the conversation, actually summarizing. So can I just summarize my understanding of the key points we've discussed so far? So giving yourself that voice and showing that you've taken on board everything that's been discussed. And of course, use of questions. So use of questions can actually reveal your thinking and where you've been focused throughout that session. So what's the key outcome from this meeting and have we met it? Is what we have agreed today aligned with our strategy? So asking some of those powerful questions. And again, these are things that you might jot down, prepare. I'm not so good at thinking in the moment. I like to have that little bit of time and maybe jot down a few things that I've got ready that, I might use or I may not, but at least I've done that thinking. So as I say, it's not about changing who we are, but being aware of how we're contributing in conversations and making that thinking more visible. And to make our contribution more visible, we need to think about those things that I've talked about, our language, the words we use, our delivery, that energy and presence, and that final point around speaking with a point of view. And what do I mean by that? So that's the last thing that I want to focus on here. Let's look at an example so I can really bring to life this point of view piece. Imagine you're at a talent review meeting to discuss the top talent in your teams and who to invest in for the coming year. And your colleague has just finished praising someone on their team who's a highly technical expert. And here are two responses. And you're feeling an emotional reaction because you don't think the person should be considered a high potential. So here are two responses, and one response is an opinion and one is a point of view. So let's look at the difference. Opinions are a personal view or a judgment formed about something, and they often start with, in my view, I think, I feel really passionate about, such as in response 1. Which starts, I don't think. Whereas a point of view is a position or perspective from which something is considered or evaluated, such as in response 2. So I've had some additional data that might provide a broader perspective. Our business has evolved, technical skills are a minimum. Let's also think about influencing, collaboration and leading teams. What does everyone else think? So you can see that a point of view puts what you're saying in that broader context and connects the dots. It starts with something bigger and broader before getting into the weeds. And it feels more objective because you're providing insights based on what you have observed, experienced, read, analysed. So here's a simple model, hopefully, that you can take away and use to build and communicate with a point of view. So, for example, if you're debating a question like, how are we doing on our diversity strategy? First of all, reflect your knowledge of what has been asked. In this example, you're building your credibility. For example, I've got experience in this topic. Then connect your response to the bigger picture, those broader contexts, the strategic goals, why it's important. And then you're making choices about what you share and how you're going to respond. And try and use that rule of 3. Try and think of 3 different things. So feedback, observation, research, something that you've read. Try and make that as broad as possible. And then finally, ask a question and listen to the response to further build that point of view. And on the, I've popped that on the worksheets, and in the workshop itself, participants have that chance to practice. So I've put it on the worksheet for you to think about, and really maybe set this as a challenge for yourself. Set a goal for making your strategic thinking more visible, and perhaps focus on it for over 3 days. Pick 3 days in a week and think, right, I'm really going to be really focused on that. You know, sometimes we feel like we need to have the answer, or the right and perfect answer, or that we maybe don't know enough or as much as others in order to provide a perspective. And this often holds us back and prevents us from speaking up confidently as we could as confidently as we could in meetings. So by trying maybe this tool with reflecting multiple viewpoints, it can be a way to increase our confidence to input in those key meetings. So I'm conscious we've covered quite a lot today, so I'm just going to bring us to a quick summary. So I'll hand over to Pauline and I'll pop these up while you chat these through.
Thank you, Orla. So let's summarize some tips to get you really focused on adding strategic value. It would be really good if you can put it in the chat to see which ones you will commit to focusing on for the next while. And I think, you know, these are all important and some resonate more than others. They're on your screen. I'm not going to read them all. I think for me, you know, thinking further out. So think about the now and also the long-term perspective. So being clear on what your long-term vision is and what you're working toward. And, you know, that is linked to, we've both talked about the job laundry, but, you know, making sure that we're not on the hamster wheel, just doing without actually seeing if we're moving in any particular direction. Another one, which Orla's just talked about, is articulating a well thought out point of view and delivering it with presence. So being mindful of the impact you're having. I think that point, well, I've just said I think, but that point that you just shared, Orla, is so powerful. It kind of takes the emotion and slightly takes us out of the room, and we're much more powerful in sharing how we feel or what we can contribute. And then another one which resonates with what Sinead talked about, but number 7, building your reputation for having a strategic mindset. So consider how you're perceived. You know, are you seen as strategic? Maybe go out and ask some trusted people and reflect on how you're currently perceived and also how you want to be perceived. Because sometimes there is a gap, but we can, you know, override that gap and we can really focus on that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pauline. I think 2, 6 and 8 seems very popular in terms of things that people are committing to. So that's fantastic. So we'll be wrapping up the day, sending everyone away with their buddy, and we've really come to the end of the programme. And at that last discovery session, we bring everyone together in that half-day session to celebrate, share successes and progress, and really look forward. Everyone shares their leadership vision, how they personally want to thrive as a leader going forward. It's really inspiring. And we also look at sustainability, how to maintain connection with your buddy, the discovery sessions, and keeping active. And it's really an opportunity to share learning. So we invite managers to that final session. Some groups invite women who they think would benefit from hearing. And everyone who attends our programme is invited to join our LinkedIn Ripple group, where we in the team regularly post insights to keep the learning alive and promote connection and sharing. And I know we can't have a big group graduation today, but I would like to invite everyone who has attended these sessions and got something from them to share their learning with another woman who maybe hasn't attended the session. We'd love to think there could be a ripple effect from these sessions that really lifts and inspires other women. So I'm going to ask Graham to launch the polls just while I summarise what we've covered today. I hope this has given you a flavour of how we deliver our programmes, as well as starting your own thinking. So a few of you have asked for the worksheet again, so we'll send that out afterwards so you can have that. And we encourage you to pull together your thinking from today using that worksheet. So just reflect on what being strategic means in your organisation and to you, your goal for becoming more strategic and working at the right level, and how you communicate strategically and make your thinking visible. And just before we finish with Pauline, myself and Sinead will stay on for some questions and answers. I do want to thank you all for joining us over these 4 weeks. I hope you've been able to reflect on and remove any headwinds that might have been getting in the way of you achieving your full potential. As I mentioned on the first session, one of the behaviours we identified in women who are successful in advancing their careers is that they believe there are no barriers to advancement, or if there were barriers, they've worked out how to get around them. So we hope you have too through these sessions, and we wish you well on your continued leadership journey. So let me stop there, and I'll stop sharing so we can see each other and just answer a few of any questions and answers that have come in. So Graham, are there any questions and answers that have come in that you think would be good for us to cover in the last couple of minutes?
Hi, so there was one question when talking about the point of view versus the opinion. Can you elaborate more on what is the common language trap?
Yes, in terms of the language that we use. Well, anything that we've talked about on the programme about diminishing our brand, our image, that point, Sinead illustrated it beautifully around talking about being busy, could be a common language trap that we fall into that doesn't actually put across how we want to portray ourselves. So that's what we mean by a common language trap, really reflecting on what are the words we're using, what are we trying to convey, and really thinking about what we might change to be perceived in a different way.
Catherine Bradley's got her hand up. I'll tell you what, Catherine, I'll just allow you to talk if you want to ask your question out loud.
I didn't know we could do that, Graham.
Catherine, if you want to talk, I've unmuted you, I think. Oh, I know, it looks like she can't.
Yeah, I think on webinar we're a bit tricky. Catherine, if you can pop it in the chat, we'll try and. Oh,
it was a mistake.
All right, okay. No
Sorry.
So we've had some questions about, so the recordings are available. So, and there's lots of people asking for the worksheets from all 4 sessions. So I don't know if that's possible, Graham.
Yeah, these will all be sent around to everyone again when I send around the video on Wednesday.
Perfect, thank you. Anything else that came up? Anything else that anyone's popped in the chat?
No, I think a few of the questions that did come up then got subsequently answered.
Fabulous, fabulous, good. Well, I'm glad we haven't got anything left. It sounds like it's been a really useful session to you. You've got 1 minute to go and get a cup of tea and prepare for your next session. So thank you all for joining us over these 4 weeks. We've really enjoyed having you, and we hope you find the worksheets and the recordings that we send out useful. So thanks for joining us.